other prisoners were like Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God. And the other prisoners were listening to them. Suddenly there was such a violent earthquake that the foundation of the prison was shaken. And once all the prison doors flew open and everybody's chains came loose. You may be seated. I want to preach for a little while today using as a subject, I found a way out. I found a way out. Would you look at the person beside you and tell them you need to hear this? Amen. Look at the person on the other side and say, I don't care what you've been in. Today, God's going to get you out of it. If that's your testimony of faith, would you give God some praise even now? I found a way out. Ladies and gentlemen, being a frequent flyer as I am, I now question the legitimacy of the slogan, flying the friendly skies. The recent outbreak by JetBlue flight attendant Steve Slater has touched a nerve on the frustration and the agony of millions of American workers who feel at this point in their life that they are underappreciated, undervalued, and taken for granted. There was a time that employees used to be perceived as a company's highest commodity. But now there's an unwritten sentiment that one should consider themselves lucky in this economy just to have a solid place of employment. So many of you have been thrown into a work environment where they almost dare you to quit, because they know that there's a line of at least 20 people who will willingly take your place the next morning. It all started on a nondescript flight from Pittsburgh to LaGuardia. And the one assigned to assist people over the last 28 years has taken his last insult and suffered his last injury. Before the plane had taken off, he had already given clear and concise instructions as to what the code of conduct ought to be on that aircraft carrier. One of the passengers, who was belligerent, irate, and rude, confronted and questioned his authority without even having a reason or grounding. Mr. Slater sucked it up and handled it with pride to the best of his ability, until they were now coming in for a landing in New York. And some inanimate object began to move itself at the hand of an anxious passenger. He ran swiftly to the row in which they were seated on and reminded them, you cannot move weight while you're still flying. You can only deal with your baggage when you've landed. And I suggest to somebody that the reason why it is the enemy oftentimes wants to keep you busy is because he doesn't want you to take time to deal with your baggage. Because if he can throw enough distractions at you, you'll never take the time to handle the weight that's over your head. He admonished her, please be seated and put that bag back, because this is not the time for you to move. Almost in righteous indignation, this woman ignored him and hit him in the head, she claims inadvertently, with her baggage. Might I pause, because there are so many of you in this room who have never worked as flight attendants, and many more who have never been on a plane. But you've been hurt by somebody you tried to help. And all you were trying to do was keep them out of harm's way. And just because you made yourself available so that they would do the right thing, they resented you. I know maybe you've never had this point in place in your own memory, but if this is not your testimony, you, friend, have never worked in ministry. But if you've ever worked in ministry, you'll know what it's like to be hit upside the head by somebody who doesn't understand your worth, your value, your call, and your purpose. Mr. Slater, in all of his anxiety, made up in his mind that he had finally come to the breaking point, that he didn't need this kind of disrespect, didn't need this kind of aggravation, didn't need this kind of stress. Grabbed 2 bottles of beer, took the PA system, and made a public announcement. Thank you for all the years you let me fly, but this is my last time. I'm over and I'm out. He walked past the people that hurt him, and here's the irony, when there was already a door next to him. The question I want to raise to him, Mr. Slater, is because you already had the key to come out the front, why did you make up in your mind to go to the middle? There are some of us that we become so frustrated in anointed leadership that we lose sense of direction. We are so close to our exit that we get so consumed with our emotions that we go away from the place we're supposed to be. I want to caution those of you who are in ministry, those of you who are working in purpose, never get to a place where you allow your emotions to push you out of your position. Never get to a place where you allow people less than you to get the best of you. He walked past all of them, and when he walked past all of them, he pulled the emergency slide exit open, released the slide, and then he slid down on the yellow tarmac by himself, walked across the tarmac, got into his car, and went home. Reverend Clemens, what a sermon and what a story of deliverance this would be if it was the end of the story. That he had waved his hands in resignation and said, that's enough. If in fact that's all that Mr. Slater did, it would be so much easier for me to preach his story. But where it is that I find conflict and consternation is that 2 days later, after the amazing finale to this dramatic exit, he now saunters to a microphone with his lawyer and now decries he wants his job back. Wait a minute, Mr. Slater, you just said that you had had enough. You can't take it anymore. You're frustrated. You're over and out. How are you going back to the thing you found an emergency exit for? Before you laugh too soon, there's so many of you who ought to interview with JetBlue tomorrow morning, because there are so many things and so many times where God gave you an emergency exit out of a frustrating and a perplexing situation, and as soon as you got out of it, you doing the best you can to get back into the exact same thing that God helped you escape from. Proverbs said, you're like a dog returning back to its own vomit. But God sent me here to say to you, please make me this promise, that if I get you out of it this time, you won't go back with anything that's in you. I know that doesn't mean anything for some of you, but there's some of us who've been so frustrated, so stressed, so worried, so agonized that we said, God, I promise you that if you get me an emergency exit, I will never go back to where I used to be before. Maybe that's not your testimony, but I came to preach to a small remnant of you that to let you know that I have found a way out. I found a way out if you're living in hurt, if you're living in abuse, if you've been living through a life of being taken for granted, if you've been underappreciated, if you've been ridiculed, if you've been chastised, if you've been isolated, if you've been mocked, if you've been attacked, if you've been underestimated, if you've been persecuted, if you've been mistreated, if you've been handled inappropriately, if you've been aligned, if you've been manipulated, I came to tell you, if you are in this house, that the Lord for you is about to provide an emergency exit. And not only is he going to give you an emergency exit, you're not going to have to fight your way out. He's going to open a damnable place for